On April 16, 1960, Irene Garza walked into Sacred Heart Church in McAllen, Texas, to confess her sins. She was 25 years old, a schoolteacher, a former beauty queen. The kind of person everyone in the Rio Grande Valley knew by name. She told her mother she wouldn't be long. 5 days later, her body was pulled from an irrigation canal. Police questioned 500 people. They administered 61 polygraph tests. They searched every field, every ditch, every stretch of road between the church and that canal. And almost immediately, they knew exactly who did it. The last person to see Irene alive was the priest who heard her confession. His name was John Feit. He had scratches on his hands that night. His personal slide viewer was found in the canal, feet from her body. He'd attacked another woman in a church just 3 weeks earlier. And within months, another priest came forward and said Feit had confessed the murder to him directly. So why wasn't he arrested? What nobody knew at the time was that the Catholic Church had already started making him disappear. They transferred him out of Texas, buried him in monasteries, and told the congregation at Irene's own funeral to stop talking about it. Local prosecutors looked the other way, and for 57 years, Irene Garza's family waited for a justice system that had already decided their daughter's life wasn't worth the scandal. This is the story of how they finally proved everyone wrong. If you're new here, this channel tells the stories of forgotten victims who finally received the justice they deserved. Every case we cover went cold, shelved for years, sometimes decades, until a breakthrough changed everything. If that's the kind of story that matters to you, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss a single one. Now, before we get to the crime, to the investigation, to the cover-up that protected a killer for nearly 6 decades, you need to know who Irene Garza actually was. Because this isn't just a cold case, this is a story about a woman whose life mattered far beyond how it ended. It was 1934, and Irene Garza was born into a family that was building something in a town that didn't make it easy. Her parents, Nicholas and Josefina, ran a dry cleaning business in McAllen, Texas, a small border city in the Rio Grande Valley. McAllen was a divided town. Railroad tracks split it in half. North of the tracks was the affluent, predominantly Anglo side. South of the tracks was Southtown, where the Mexican-American families lived. The public swimming pool, the Cascade, had once barred Hispanics entirely. If you were brown in McAllen, you knew which side of the line you stood on. The Garzas lived on the south side. Nicholas worked long hours building the business from nothing. As it grew and the family prospered, they eventually moved north of the railroad tracks into a more affluent neighborhood. In the 1940s, McAllen, a Mexican-American family buying a home on the Anglo side of town, said something that didn't need words. Irene thrived. At McAllen High School, she became the first Latina twirler and head drum majorette in the school's history. In a town where that barrier had never been crossed, Irene crossed it with grace and without apology. She wasn't making a political statement. She was simply excellent. And excellence has a way of making walls look small. She went on to Pan American College, where she was crowned both prom queen and homecoming queen. In 1958, she was named Miss All South Texas Sweetheart. She was fair-skinned, polished, and remembered for her pillbox hats and sweater sets. She was also the first person in her entire family to attend college and go on to graduate school. She was proof of what was possible. But the titles and the crowns weren't what made people love Irene Garza. What made them love her was what she did with her life after the ceremonies ended. Irene became a second-grade teacher at Thigpen Elementary, a school on McAllen's south side that served the city's most disadvantaged children. Her students came from the colonias, the unincorporated settlements along the Texas-Mexico border, where running water and paved roads were luxuries. Some of these children walked to school barefoot. They didn't have school supplies. Some of them didn't have enough to eat. Irene spent her first paycheck buying those children clothes and books because she couldn't stand the thought of a child sitting in her classroom without shoes on their feet. Her fellow teachers at Thigpen remembered her as someone who gave everything she had to those kids and somehow always seemed to have more to give. She was also deeply, genuinely devout. A member of the Legion of Mary, Irene attended Mass and Communion every single day, not on Sundays, every day. Her faith wasn't performative or occasional. It was the center of her identity, the foundation on which she built her entire life. The church was her sanctuary, the place where she felt closest to God, and the people around her could see it. Men reportedly attended Mass at Sacred Heart just to catch a glimpse of her. She was the kind of person an entire community claimed as their own, the daughter everyone wished they had. 7 days before she died, Irene sat down and wrote a 5-page letter to a friend. In it, she talked about her growing confidence, about being elected secretary of the Parent-Teacher Association, about her students. She described herself as extremely shy, but said she was getting better. And then she wrote something that, knowing what was about to happen, is almost unbearable to read. She told her friend that she had been afraid of death, but that her daily communion had cured her of that fear, that her faith had given her courage and happiness she couldn't have imagined. 1 week later, she walked into Sacred Heart Church and placed her life in the hands of a man who would take it from her. If Irene's story is one you think more people need to hear, a like on this video goes a long way in making sure it reaches them. April 16, 1960, Holy Saturday, the evening before Easter Sunday. In the Rio Grande Valley, this was one of the most sacred nights of the year. Churches were packed. The faithful lined up for confession, wanting to enter the holiest day of the Christian calendar with a clean conscience and an unburdened soul. At Sacred Heart Church in McAllen, lines for the confessional stretched through the sanctuary. Multiple priests were hearing confession simultaneously to accommodate the crowd. Irene borrowed the family car that evening, sometime around 6:30 p.m. She told her mother, Josephina, that she was heading to Sacred Heart for confession and that she wouldn't be long. It was a 12-block drive from the Garza home. She'd made the trip hundreds of times before. She planned to confess, come home, and prepare for Easter the next morning. Multiple parishioners saw Irene at the church that night, and their accounts would later become critical pieces of evidence. One parishioner watched her make the sign of the cross as she entered the sanctuary. Another saw her kneeling alone in a 5th-row pew, her white lace veil draped over her head. A third remembered Irene approaching and asking if she could move up in the confession line because she was running late. She was polite about it, apologetic even. She just wanted to get home to her parents. Among the priests hearing confessions that evening was Father John Feit, a 27-year-old visiting priest from Chicago who had been assigned to Sacred Heart for pastoral training. Feit had arrived in McAllen in June 1959, sent by the missionary oblates of Mary Immaculate because of a severe priest shortage in the valley. He was bright, well-mannered, and fluent in Spanish. He was also, by several accounts, oddly aloof, a little too polished, a little too comfortable with himself. When someone once asked him why he became a priest, he reportedly said, "I just wanted to give it a try." Not exactly the answer you would expect from a man who'd been in seminary since he was 13. What happened inside Sacred Heart Church that night is where Irene Garza's story shatters. Feit would later admit that he heard Irene's confession that evening, but not in the sanctuary, where confessions were typically heard that night through the standard confessional screens. He took Irene to the rectory, a private room, away from the other parishioners, the other priests, and anyone who might have seen or heard what happened next. Pulling a young woman out of the main confession line and into a private room was highly irregular. People who knew church protocol said it simply should not have happened. Parishioners waiting for confession noticed something else that night. Feit's line stalled. He was absent for long stretches, People waiting to confess to him grew frustrated and confused as the minutes ticked by and the priest behind the screen simply didn't return. Nobody thought much of it at the time. Later, the gaps in his presence that night would take on a very different meaning. Nobody saw Irene leave the church, not a single person. Her car sat parked down the street from Sacred Heart, untouched. Hours passed. Josefina and Nicholas waited at home, expecting their daughter to walk through the door at any moment. They initially assumed she had stayed for the Easter Vigil service, which ran late into the night at most parishes. But midnight came, then 1 o'clock, then 2. The house was silent. The car was gone. Their daughter was not home. By 3 in the morning on Easter Sunday, Nicholas Garza drove to the McAllen Police Department and filed a missing persons report. It was the holiest morning of the Christian year, and the Garza family was standing in a police station trying to explain to her officers that their 25-year-old daughter had gone to church and never came back. Easter Sunday passed with no sign of Irene. Then Monday. The Garza family's panic deepened with each hour. On April 18th, 2 days after Irene disappeared, evidence started turning up scattered along McCall Road, a stretch of road on the outskirts of McAllen. A passerby named P.W. Miller spotted a single beige high-heeled shoe near the curb. It was a left shoe, a fiancé's brand pump. A fellow teacher from Thigpen Elementary, Alfredo Pee-wee Barrera, found Irene's black patent leather purse lying in a field a short distance away. Her driver's license was still inside. Further along, her white lace veil, the one parishioners had seen her wearing at Sacred Heart just 2 nights before, was discovered in the brush. The trail of belongings along that road told a story that no one in the Garza family wanted to hear. Something violent had happened, and the person responsible had driven this road with Irene, or with what belonged to her, sometime after she vanished from the church. What followed was the largest search operation in Rio Grande Valley history. 70 members of the Hidalgo County Sheriff's posse on horseback fanned out across the brush country. Skin divers dragged the irrigation canals. 2 border patrol planes flew grid patterns overhead. 65 National Guardsmen joined the ground search, walking shoulder to shoulder through fields and ditches. Hundreds of volunteers organized their own search parties. Irene Garza was their neighbor, their daughter's teacher, their friend. The entire city was mobilized. False leads tormented the family. A woman called claiming to be Irene, saying she had been kidnapped in the nearby town of Hidalgo. It was a hoax. A drunk man in Edinburgh walked into a police station and confessed to the murder. Detectives questioned him for hours before determining his confession was fabricated. Every false alarm reignited hope and crushed it again within hours. Then came Thursday, April 21st, 5 days after Irene had walked into Sacred Heart Church. At 7:40 in the morning, a phone call came into the police department. A body had been spotted floating in the 2nd Street Canal, a concrete irrigation channel near Business 83 and 2nd Street, across from the local Sears department store. It was Irene. She was still wearing most of her clothing, though her shoes and undergarments were missing. Her lavender blouse was unbuttoned. Her petticoat had ballooned over her head in the water. The right side of her face was severely bruised and swollen, and she had 2 black eyes. The official cause of death, recorded on the death certificate, was trauma to the right side of her head causing brain hemorrhage, combined with suffocation. The degree of decomposition told investigators something chilling. She had been dead for slightly fewer than 4 days, which meant that after disappearing from the church on Saturday night, Irene may have been held alive for up to a day before being killed. The gap between her disappearance and her death suggested captivity. Any biological evidence had been washed away by the canal water, but the scene on the canal bank spoke clearly. A muddy men's shoe print was pressed into the earth near the water's edge. A strand of Irene's hair was tangled in the mud of that footprint. Tire tracks ran along the bank. There was a visible imprint in the soil where a body had been set down and dragged to the water. Candelabra belonging to Sacred Heart Church were pulled from the canal, and when the canal was fully drained weeks later, investigators found one more piece of evidence sitting in the silt, just feet from where Irene's body had been floating. A light green Eastman Coda slide viewer with a long black cord attached to it. A small personal device used to view photographic slides, the kind of thing someone would carry in a pocket. That slide viewer belonged to Father John Feit. He admitted as much. He said he had bought it the previous summer at a drugstore in Port Isabel. What he never explained, not to the police, not to the investigators, not to anyone, was how his personal property ended up at the bottom of a canal next to a dead woman's body. John Bernard Feit was born on November 24, 1932 in Chicago, the youngest of 3 children in a German Catholic family. His uncle was a priest. His brother Matthias would become one too. At 13, his parents sent him to an all-boys seminary in San Antonio, run by the missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate. He was ordained on September 8, 1958, and sent to the Rio Grande Valley almost immediately, arriving at Sacred Heart in McAllen in June 1959 for pastoral training. He was 27 years old, bright, articulate, fluent in Spanish, described by some parishioners as charming, described by others as cold, as someone who maintained a careful distance from the people around him. In the days after Irene's body was found, Feit's account of that night began to shift in ways that investigators noticed immediately. He initially told police that Irene came to the rectory with a question of conscience, and that he simply directed her back to the sanctuary. This was his first story, but later, under more pointed questioning, he changed it. He admitted that he had actually heard her confession privately in the rectory. That shift was significant. It meant Feit was, by his own admission, the last known person to see Irene alive, alone with her in a private room, away from witnesses. Father Joseph O'Brien, the warm and well-liked assistant pastor at Sacred Heart, had been paying close attention. After midnight mass that Holy Saturday, O'Brien noticed conspicuous scratches on Feit's hands. Fresh scratches. The kind you'd get from a struggle, or from gripping something rough in a hurry. Feit had an explanation ready. He said he had broken his glasses during the evening, driven 5 miles to the pastoral house in San Juan, found himself locked out, and had to climb up to a second-floor balcony to get inside, scraping his hands on the brick exterior of the building. 5 miles. In the middle of hearing confessions on the busiest night of the church year, to retrieve glasses from a building he somehow couldn't enter through the front door. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because what investigators discovered next revealed that the Garza case wasn't isolated. It was a pattern. 3 weeks before Irene's murder, on March 23, 1960, a 20-year-old college student named Maria America Guerra was kneeling at the communion rail inside Sacred Heart Church in Edinburgh, about 12 miles north of McAllen. She was alone in the church, praying her rosary. A man approached from behind, grabbed her, and tried to force a cloth or rag over her mouth. Guerra fought hard. She bit the man's finger until it bled freely. The attacker released her, and she ran. When she reported the assault, Guerra told police she believed her attacker was a priest. Investigators quickly connected the incident to Feit. He admitted he had been at Sacred Heart in Edinburgh earlier that afternoon. He was driving a blue and white 1956 Ford sedan, which matched the description multiple witnesses gave of a vehicle seen near the church around the time of the attack. His right hand was injured. He told colleagues at Sacred Heart in McAllen that he'd hurt his finger on a mimeograph machine, but a church secretary who examined the wound said those were clearly bite marks, not machine injuries. The pattern of the wound matched teeth, not gears. Maria America Guerra was brought in for a lineup. She identified John Feit as her attacker. An eyewitness to the assault did the same. The parallels were impossible to ignore. A young woman attacked inside a church while praying. Another young woman murdered after going to confession in a church. Both crimes committed against women who were alone, vulnerable, and engaged in religious devotion. Both connected to the same 27-year-old visiting priest. The McAllen police brought in the elite Chicago polygraph firm John E. Reed and Associates to test Feit. The examination stretched over 2 full days in June 1960. The examiners were thorough. Their final report concluded that the test results definitely implicated him in both crimes, and that the examiner was convinced that the subject was not telling the truth when he denied killing Irene Garza or attacking Maria Guerra. During the examination, Feit reportedly made a statement that would echo through the decades to come. He told the examiners, with what investigators described as unsettling calm, that there would never be any evidence turning up, and that without a confession, they didn't have enough to convict him. He was daring them. And for a long time, he was right. Initially, McAllen police told the press that Feit had passed the polygraph. This was not true. The results were later quietly revised to inconclusive. The original examiner would eventually say, years afterward, that he had always believed Feit failed. I mean, think about that for a second. The scratches on his hands, the slide viewer in the canal, the attack on Maria America Guerra just weeks earlier, the victim identifying him in a lineup, the polygraph report saying he was lying, the fact that he was the last person alive to see Irene in a private room with no witnesses. Every single thread of evidence pointed to one man, and the system looked the other way. If you're wondering how that's even possible, so is everyone else. And the answer has nothing to do with the lack of evidence. It has everything to do with what happened behind closed doors between the Catholic Church and the prosecutors. If this case is getting under your skin the way it should, subscribe to the channel, because what comes next is the part of this story that turns frustration into fury. The Maria America Guerra case went to trial before the murder charge could be pursued. In 1961, Feit was tried in Austin for assault with intent to commit a violent crime against Guerra. The jury deadlocked, reportedly 9-3 in favor of conviction. A hung jury. Rather than face a retrial in which those odds were unlikely to improve, Feit's legal team negotiated a PLE. In 1962, he pleaded no contest to a reduced charge of aggravated assault, a misdemeanor. His punishment was a $500 fine. No jail time. Not a single day behind bars. Years later, he would claim that he didn't even understand that a no contest plea counted as a conviction. Whether that was genuine confusion or calculated naivete, the outcome was the same. He walked away clean. But the plea deal on the Guerra case wasn't just about Maria America Guerra. It was the other half of a larger arrangement. And what happened in the background reveals a coordinated effort between the church and the criminal justice system to ensure that John Feit was never tried for the murder of Irene Garza. At the 2017 trial, attorney and former television reporter Daryl Davis took the stand and testified about a conversation he had witnessed decades earlier. He said that the district attorney at the time, a man named Robert Lattimore, had gathered a small group of media members for an off-the-record briefing. In that meeting, Lattimore told the reporters that both prosecutors and Catholic Church officials knew John Feit murdered Irene Garza. The Guerra plea deal, Davis testified, had been arranged as part of a broader agreement. Feit would plead to the lesser charge on the Guerra assault. In exchange, the Hidalgo County District Attorney's Office would not pursue murder charges in the Garza case, and the church would take care of the rest, transferring Feit to a monastery far from Texas, where he would be quietly disciplined outside the reach of public scrutiny. The Garza family would never be told. The community would eventually move on. The scandal would suffocate in silence. The physical proof that this conspiracy was real had been sitting in oblate church records for more than half a century, waiting to be found. A letter dated August 1, 1960, written by Father J.F. Paulecki to Father Lawrence Seidel, who headed the Oblate's southern province. That letter was subpoenaed for the 2017 trial. And when it was read aloud in the Hidalgo County courtroom 57 years after it was written, the impact was seismic. The letter relayed advice from the sheriff of Hidalgo County, E. Vickers, who was himself a Catholic. Sheriff Vickers recommended that the church transfer Feit to another part of the country as a normal obedience to get him out of the area of suspicion. The letter stated plainly that the longer time we have, the weaker the case gets. It warned that the Garza case could give the opponents of the church a field day and could become a juicy scandal for the opposition to Kennedy during the 1960 presidential campaign, when Catholic candidate John F. Kennedy was already fighting anti-Catholic prejudice on the national stage. The letter also expressed concern about the Masons exploiting the controversy against the church. The letter had been written after consultation with Bishop Riker. It discussed strategy, optics, political calculations, and institutional survival. And in all of those carefully worded paragraphs, the letter never once mentioned Irene Garza by name. Not once. It never mentioned her parents. It never mentioned the 25-year-old schoolteacher who walked into one of their churches to confess her sins and never walked out alive. The woman at the center of this entire catastrophe was erased from the document that decided her killer's fate. Only the church's reputation mattered. The silence wasn't confined to letters passed between officials in private. It was enforced from the pulpit, directly to the faces of the people who were grieving. At Our Lady of Sorrows Church, during a service held in the aftermath of Irene's death, a priest stood before a congregation that included people who had known Irene personally, people who had taught alongside her, parents of the children she had clothed and fed with her own money, and he delivered a message that would echo through the community for the next 60 years. He said, "It is impossible that a priest would commit a crime like this. Don't speak of it. Don't even let yourselves think it." In a deeply Catholic, heavily Hispanic community, where a priest's word carried the weight of divine instruction, that statement was devastating. Families who had suspicions stopped voicing them. People who had seen things at the church that night stopped talking. The community's instinct to demand answers was smothered by religious authority telling them that seeking those answers was itself a sin. Noemi Sigler, Irene's cousin, would later describe a memory that captured the toll this silence took. Her father, Milo Ponce, had been one of the original investigating deputies on the Garza case. Sigler remembered him sitting at the family kitchen table one evening, weeping. He had been ordered to hand over his investigative files and step aside so that higher-ranking officials could take control. He knew the case was being buried. He knew the man who killed Irene was going to walk free, and there was nothing he could do about it. After the plea deal closed the door on prosecution, the Catholic Church moved John Feit through a carefully planned sequence of transfers, each one putting more distance between him and Texas, between him and the evidence, between him and the memory of what he had done. First came the Trappist monastery at New Melleray Abbey in Dubuque, Iowa. Then, Assumption Abbey in Ava, Missouri. Then, in 1966, the servants of the Paraclete Treatment Center at Jemez Springs, New Mexico, a facility designed specifically for priests with behavioral problems. At Jemez Springs, Feit didn't just receive treatment. He rose to a supervisory position, eventually evaluating which troubled priests were fit to return to active ministry. A man who had murdered a woman inside a church was now deciding the futures of other problematic priests. But while Feit was quietly building his second life inside church facilities, the truth was finding its way to the surface. Slowly, reluctantly, and through channels nobody expected. In 1963, at the Missouri monastery, A young monk named Dale Tacheny was assigned to counsel Feit during a series of therapeutic sessions. Tacheny was earnest, compassionate, and devoted to his calling. Feit was struggling with what Tacheny initially understood as some kind of spiritual crisis. During those counseling sessions, Feit opened up, and what he told Tacheny changed everything. Feit confessed. He told Tacheny that after hearing a young woman's confession on Easter weekend, he had attacked her. He described binding and gagging her and placing her in the basement of the rectory. He told Tacheny that he left the rectory and that when he returned later, she was dead. Feit described the moment with a chilling detail that Tacheny would carry for decades. Feit said that as he left, he could hear her saying, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." When he came back, she was gone. Feit also told Tacheny something that revealed the full scope of how the system had protected him. He said he had been able to escape justice because, in his own words, "The church helped me. Law enforcement helped me. The seal of confession helped me." Tacheny was shaken to his core, but he did not go to the police. He was a young monk, living inside the very institution that was protecting Feit. Challenging the church meant challenging the foundation of his entire life. He stayed silent. For decades, the weight of what he knew pressed down on him. He thought about Irene Garza's parents. He thought about what they didn't know, and he carried that burden alone. The second confession came from someone even closer to the crime. Father Joseph O'Brien, the assistant pastor at Sacred Heart who had noticed the scratches on Feit's hands the night Irene vanished, had never stopped pressing for the truth. O'Brien liked Irene, the entire parish did, and the unanswered questions gnawed at him. He confronted Feit repeatedly over the weeks and months that followed. And eventually, at the Oblate's headquarters in San Antonio, Feit broke down and admitted the murder to O'Brien directly. O'Brien didn't go to the police. He would later explain that he didn't want to embarrass the Oblates and that he feared Feit would simply deny everything and sue him for slander. So instead of going to the authorities, O'Brien went to Irene's devastated parents. He sat with Nicholas and Josephina Garza and told them that the church's internal discipline of Feit would be greater than any sentence handed down by the courts. That was a lie, and O'Brien knew it was a lie. The church wasn't disciplining Feit. They were relocating him. They were giving him a new start in a new place where no one knew what he had done. There was no internal punishment that matched the taking of a human life. There was only institutional self-preservation dressed up in the language of spiritual authority. Two separate confessions. Two men who knew that John Feit murdered Irene Garza. And decades of silence, because the system that heard those confessions decided that the truth was less important than its own comfort. In the early 1970s, Feit left the priesthood entirely. He married, moved to the Phoenix area, eventually settling in Scottsdale. He raised 3 children. He got a job in food service management. For 17 years, he volunteered at the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, a Catholic charity. He led what appeared to be a completely ordinary suburban life, the kind of life you'd glance at and forget. If you met John Feit at a neighborhood barbecue or a church fundraiser, you would have seen a quiet, aging retiree, not a man who had killed a young woman in a confessional and spent his entire adult life walking free because the most powerful religious institution on earth decided to protect him. He was free for nearly 60 years. Irene Garza's family was not. In the Rio Grande Valley, the Garza case became something people whispered about in private, but rarely discussed openly. In a community where the Catholic Church's word carried the weight of divine authority, where questioning a priest was considered almost sacrilegious, the silence held. The case faded from headlines and evening news broadcasts. It did not fade from the hearts of the people who loved Irene. Noemi Ponce Sigler made it her life's mission. Irene's cousin and the daughter of the deputy who had wept at his kitchen table after being forced off the case, Sigler devoted more than 30 years to keeping the investigation alive. She did it largely on her own. She knocked on doors across the valley and beyond, tracking down witnesses who had scattered over the decades. She cataloged every piece of evidence she could find. She attended every public meeting where the case might come up. She filed requests with police departments and prosecutors' offices. She cornered every new police chief, every new district attorney, every journalist who came through McAllen, and she made them listen. She made them hear the name Irene Garza. Linda de la Vina, another of Irene's cousins, fought alongside her with the same quiet, relentless determination. Together, the two women became the case's unofficial guardians. Not detectives, not lawyers, just family. Two women who refused to let the system bury their cousin's memory along with the evidence. In 2002, something finally cracked. McAllen Police Chief Victor Rodriguez formally asked the newly created Texas Rangers Unsolved Crimes Investigation Team to take a fresh look at the Garza case. Ranger Lieutenant Rudy Jaramillo was assigned to lead the effort. And in a coincidence that felt almost like fate intervening, that same year, Dale Tacheny finally picked up a phone. Tacheny, now decades removed from his time at the Missouri monastery, called a San Antonio detective named George Seidler. He told Seidler that in 1963, a priest at a monastery in Missouri had confessed to attacking and killing a young woman on Easter weekend. There was a complication. Tacheny remembered the priest saying the crime had occurred in San Antonio, not McAllen. The lead initially stalled because the San Antonio police couldn't find a matching case. It wasn't until a Texas Ranger made the connection between Tacheny's account and the details of the Garza case in McAllen that the pieces finally locked into place. Jaramillo then tracked down Father Joseph O'Brien, who was now elderly and in declining health. For the first time speaking on the record, O'Brien admitted what he had known for over 4 decades. John Feit had confessed the murder of Irene Garza to him directly, shortly after the crime. 2 confessions confirmed independently 40 years after the fact. The case should have been reopened immediately, but it wasn't, because the man who had the power to bring charges had no interest in doing so. The longtime Hidalgo County District Attorney, Rene Guerra, had held office for roughly 32 years. He was a political institution in his own right. Under public pressure, Guerra took the case to a grand jury in 2004, but he did not subpoena the key witnesses. He didn't call Dale Tacheny. He didn't call Father O'Brien. He didn't call Feit. He presented a hollow case to a grand jury that had no choice but to decline to indict because the crucial testimony was never placed before them. When the family protested, Guerra told Linda de la Vina directly that they would never get an indictment. When a reporter asked him why anyone would still be haunted by the case, his answer was stunning. He said she died. Her killer got away. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Not loudly enough. At least not yet. In April 2005, Texas Monthly published a landmark investigative report by journalist Pamela Koloff. The article titled Unholy Act was a meticulous, deeply reported narrative that laid out the evidence, the church involvement, the prosecutors' inaction, and the family's decades-long fight in devastating, unsparing detail. It put the Garza case back in the national spotlight at a moment when the Catholic clergy abuse scandal was dominating headlines across America. CBS's 48 Hours followed with its own televised investigation. The public pressure on Hidalgo County mounted, but Rene Guerra still would not act. Father Joseph O'Brien died in September 2005 at age 77. He never testified under oath about what Feit had told him. His account would eventually reach a jury, but only through the second-hand testimony of a journalist who had interviewed him before his death. O'Brien went to his grave without ever sitting in a witness chair and telling the world what he knew. If he had lived just a few more years, if the case had moved faster, the outcome might have arrived a decade sooner. Instead, the family waited. In 2014, a 41-year-old former district judge named Ricardo Rodriguez Jr. decided to challenge René Guerra for the Hidalgo County District Attorney's seat. Rodriguez was the son of migrant farm workers. He had grown up in the valley, worked his way through law school, risen to the bench, and understood the community in a way that Guerra, after 3 decades of entrenched political comfort, no longer seemed to. Rodriguez made the Garza case a centerpiece of his campaign. He told voters plainly and publicly that if they elected him, he would pursue justice for Irene Garza, not as a political stunt, not as a campaign slogan to be forgotten after Election Day. As a binding promise. Irene's family believed him. Nomi Sigler and Linda De La Vina threw themselves into Rodriguez's campaign. They knocked on doors. They told their story to anyone who would listen. They looked voters in the eye and said, "This man will do what no one else has been willing to do for 54 years." Rodriguez won decisively, capturing 64% of the vote. It wasn't close. After decades of being told to be quiet, told to accept the outcome, told that pigs would fly before Irene got justice, the people of Hidalgo County voted in overwhelming numbers for the man who promised to try. He took office in January 2015. By April 2015, he had formally reopened the Garza case. His office assembled a prosecution team, located and contacted witnesses, and began building a case from evidence that was now more than half a century old. In February 2016, a Hidalgo County grand jury, this time presented with the actual evidence and the actual witnesses, returned an indictment. John Bernard Feit was charged with the murder of Irene Garza. Feit was 83 years old. He was living in quiet retirement in Scottsdale, Arizona. On February 9, 2016, law enforcement officers arrived at his door. His response when they told him why they had come was measured, controlled, and almost rehearsed. "I've been questioned extensively about this dating back to 1960, he said. "So I'm disappointed, but not surprised." Disappointed, not surprised, not alarmed, not confused, not outraged. The reaction of a man who had spent 56 years expecting a knock at the door and had simply decided to see how long he could outrun it. He was extradited to Texas. He entered a plea of not guilty. Bond was set at $1 million by Judge Luis Singletary. Feit would ultimately spend 648 days in the Hidalgo County Jail awaiting trial. 56 years after Irene Garza walked into Sacred Heart Church for confession and never came home, the man who killed her was finally going to face a jury. November 30th, 2017. The 92nd State District Court at the Hidalgo County Courthouse in Edinburgh, Texas. Judge Luis Singletary presiding. 57 years and 7 months after the crime. The gallery was packed. Garza family members on one side, media from across the country on the other. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Michael Garza, no relation to the victim. The defense team was headed by O. Rene Flores. The trial would stretch over 7 days and feature 22 prosecution witnesses. Michael Garza's opening statement set the tone. He described Feit as a wolf in priest's clothing waiting to attack, a predator who came to the Rio Grande Valley to find his prey. The prosecution's case rested on 2 pillars: the circumstantial evidence from 1960, the slide viewer, the scratches, the shifting stories, the prior attack on Guerra, and the polygraph results, and the confessions. The testimony of the people Feit had told the truth to when he believed the truth would never see the inside of a courtroom. The star witness was Dale Tacheny. Now elderly and visibly emotional, Tacheny took the stand and recounted what John Feit had confessed to him at the Missouri monastery in 1963. Feit had described hearing a young woman's confession, then attacking her. He bound and gagged her. He put her in the basement of the rectory. He told Tacheny that when he left, he could hear her saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." When he returned, she was dead. Feit told Tacheny he had escaped justice because, in his own words, "The church helped me. Law enforcement helped me. The seal of confession helped me. Tachany's voice broke on the stand. When the prosecution asked him the question the entire courtroom was thinking, why he had waited 40 years to come forward, his answer landed in silence. 2 words. She had parents. The courtroom went still. Nobody moved. Jurors wiped their eyes. Family members in the gallery wept openly. Those 2 words contained everything. The guilt of knowing. The weight of silence. The image of Nicholas and Josefina Garza living out their remaining years without ever hearing the truth about what happened to their daughter. She had parents. Parents who waited at that kitchen table on Easter Sunday, wondering where their little girl was. Parents who buried her without answers. Parents who died without ever seeing the man who took her held accountable. And Tachany had spent 40 years knowing he could have given them the answers they were dying for, and choosing not to. That guilt was written across his face for every person in that courtroom to see. Other witnesses built the case piece by piece. Ana Maria Cavazos Hollingsworth, a lifelong friend of Irene's, testified that during Holy Week, 1960, just days before the murder, Irene had confided in her that she was disturbed by a new priest who thinks he's handsome and who had previously pulled her out of the standard confession line and into the rectory. Cleotilda Tilly Sanchez, a former cook and secretary at the church, testified that Feit had once looked at her and said, "How about we close the door and make Tilly disappear?" She also testified that after Irene's murder, she received a threatening phone call. A voice told her, "You're next, Tilly." Brooks Egerton, a former Dallas Morning News reporter, took the stand to convey the account that Father O'Brien had given him in interviews before O'Brien's death, detailing Feit's direct admission of murder. Then the Palicki letter was read aloud to the jury. The August 1st, 1960 letter that laid out the plan to transfer Feit out of the area, the sheriff's advice that the longer they waited, the weaker the case would become, and the concern that the scandal could damage John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign. Every calculated word hung in the air of that courtroom. The jury heard a 60-year-old document prove in black and white that the cover-up was not speculation, not conspiracy theory, not the frustrated imagination of a grieving family. It was coordinated. It was written down. And it was done with the full knowledge that a woman was dead and her killer was being deliberately set free. Clergy abuse expert Thomas Doyle, testifying for the prosecution, examined the letter and the broader pattern of church involvement. He told the jury it was the first time he had ever seen any organized plan of obfuscation, collusion, and cover-up played out step by step in coordination with the civilian law enforcement. Coming from a man who had spent his career studying institutional abuse within the Catholic Church, that statement carried enormous weight. The defense fought the case on the only ground available. Irene Flores reminded the jury that there was no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no eyewitness to the crime itself. He attacked the slide viewer as circumstantial, pointing out gaps in the 1960 police records. He argued that Tachany's testimony was protected by priest-penitent privilege, and he noted that Feit had lived a law-abiding life for more than half a century since the crime. Feit himself did not take the stand. He sat through the trial day after day, chewing gum, making notes on a legal pad, showing no visible emotion. Not when Tachany described the confession, not when the letter was read, not when family members wept in the gallery. His face remained blank. When the jury was about to return its verdict, Feit removed his hearing aids. On December 7, 2017, at 8:17 in the evening, after roughly 6 hours of deliberation, a jury of 7 women and 5 men returned their verdict. Guilty, murder with malice aforethought. The next day, December 8th, the jury reconvened for sentencing. Prosecutor Michael Garza asked for a symbolic 57 years, one for each year that Feit had lived as a free man while Irene's family waited for justice. Instead of praying for her soul, he prayed for a victim, Garza told the jurors. The defense asked for probation, arguing that Feit was now an elderly man with no criminal record in the decades since the crime. The jury rejected both positions. They sentenced John Bernard Feit to life in prison. Before the sentence was formally handed down, the court heard victim impact statements. Irene's high school sweetheart, Arturo Torres, stood up in that courtroom and faced the man who had killed the woman he once loved. His words were simple and devastating. "I'm really happy that the jury sentenced you for life," Torres said. "But you know what? That's nowhere near what you did to Irene." After the verdict was read, the Hidalgo County courtroom erupted. 57 years of grief and silence and anger broke open all at once. Nomi Ponce Sigler, who had spent more than 30 years fighting for this single moment, collapsed into the arms of prosecutor Michael Garza and wept. Linda de la Viña found Police Chief Victor Rodriguez, the man who had asked the Texas Rangers to reopen the case 15 years earlier, and embraced him. Family members held each other. Some dropped to their knees and prayed, some stood in silence, staring at nothing, unable to process that the day they had stopped believing would ever come had actually arrived. Sigler spoke to reporters through tears. "Justice was served," she said. "Irene finally got her day in court, and that's all we wanted." Linda de la Viña's words carried the full weight of everything the family had endured for nearly 6 decades. "It's been a long-awaited moment," she said, "and after 57 years, we have found justice for Irene, and we have spoken truth to power. To the power of the Catholic Church, and to the power of the former political leaders in Hidalgo County that let us down." Family member Nicholas Cavazos walked toward Feit, pointed directly at him and said, "I remember my grandfather, and how this man destroyed his faith in God, and he never went to church again." That single sentence captured something the legal system could never repair. The murder of Irene Garza didn't just take one life, it fractured an entire community's relationship with the institution they had trusted most deeply. For decades, the people of the Rio Grande Valley had lived with the knowledge that their church, the place they brought their children, the place they went for comfort and guidance and forgiveness, had chosen its own reputation over a woman's life. Nicholas Cavazos' grandfather lost his faith the day he lost his belief that the church would protect the people inside it. He never went back, and he was far from the only one. Feit was transferred to the Texas state prison system. He filed an appeal with the 13th Court of Appeals in Corpus Christi, raising 11 points of error, including arguments about the earlier plea agreement and the admissibility of testimony under priest-penitent privilege. The appeal was never decided. On a Tuesday morning in February 2020, guards at the Estelle unit found John Feit unresponsive in his cell shortly before 5 o'clock in the morning. He was rushed to Huntsville Hospital and pronounced dead at 5:38 a.m. The preliminary cause of death was cardiac arrest. He was 87 years old. In the months before his death, his health had deteriorated significantly. He suffered from stage 3 kidney disease, bladder cancer, spinal stenosis, and diabetes. His legal team had fought for compassionate release. The courts denied it. He died behind bars. He never expressed remorse. Not once, in 60 years, did he publicly acknowledge what he had done to Irene Garza. He never apologized to her family. He never admitted his guilt to a court. He went to his death maintaining the same silence that the institution had taught him to keep. When Nomi Sigler learned of his death, her response was measured and quiet. "He now stands in front of the ultimate judge," she said. "He left this earth, never showing remorse for killing Irene. God have mercy on his soul." Ricardo Rodriguez Jr., the district attorney who made a campaign promise and kept it, won re-election in 2018 with nearly 80% of the vote. The community had spoken again, even more loudly than the first time. Renee Guerra, the district attorney who had refused to prosecute and who told the family that their daughter's killer had simply gotten away, lost to Rodriguez, and later said that the Garza case had murdered me politically. Texas Ranger Rudy Jaramillo, who had led the reinvestigation starting in 2002, was in the courtroom for the verdict. He called it such a sense of relief. After 15 years of work on the case, he said it was what he'd been waiting for. Irene Garza was not a case number. She was not a headline. She was not defined by what was done to her in the basement of a rectory on a holy Saturday night. She was the girl who broke the color barrier at McAllen High School, twirling a baton down a football field in a town that didn't think someone who looked like her belonged there. She was the teacher who spent her first paycheck on shoes for children who came to her classroom without any. She was the woman who attended Mass every single day, not because someone told her to, but because she loved God and believed that God loved her back. She was the daughter who told her mother she'd be right back. She was 25 years old. She had her whole life in front of her. Linda de la Vigna called Irene our beacon of hope that gave us the strength to speak truth to power and to never give up. For 57 years, the system that was supposed to protect Irene Garza failed her at every level. The church she loved chose silence over justice. The prosecutors who had the power to act chose political comfort over courage. The community that adored her was told from the pulpit to stop asking questions and stop even thinking about the truth. But her family didn't stop. Noemi Sigler didn't stop knocking on doors. Linda de la Vigna didn't stop making phone calls. And when Ricardo Rodriguez Jr. stood in front of the voters of Hidalgo County and promised to do what no one before him had been willing to do, the people of the valley didn't just elect a district attorney. They chose, finally, after 57 years of enforced silence, to stop being quiet. Justice arrived late. It arrived in a courtroom in Edinburgh, Texas, with a jury of 7 women and 5 men who looked at the evidence, heard the confessions, read the cover-up letter, and decided that Irene Garza's life was worth more than any institution's comfort. It arrived late, but it arrived. And that is why we tell these stories, because every victim deserves to be more than a cold case file collecting dust in a storage room. Every family deserves answers, no matter how many decades it takes. And every story that ends with justice, however delayed, is proof that giving up was never the only option. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Cold Case Redemption, and know that every time you show up for one of these videos, you're helping make sure that victims like Irene Garza are remembered for who they were, not just how their stories ended.